Hi, I'm Chris Benstead from the Driving Instructor and Trainers Collective, theditc.co.uk, signposting point for the industry, where you can come to find information that you're not sure where to look for it. That's what we do. I am also a specialist theory trainer and I run Theory Test Explained, supporting your pupils who are struggling with the theory test, helping them to understand the way the test works and the questions, have the knowledge, be able to pass, and then help stop them holding you up because they can't book or take their practical test. So that's what I do. If you want to find me via theditc.co.uk or hit me up on Facebook and we can have a chat. Thank you.
Right, good evening everybody and welcome to the fourth episode of DIA's Motormouth, hosted by myself, Carly Brookfield, the self-proclaimed and quite well-known Motormouth of Driving Instructors Association. Tonight I am joined by one of our regular panellists who you all know and love already, I believe, which is Chris Benstead, who, if you don't know him by now, I will let him give a brief intro in a moment. And I'm very pleased to be joined tonight by Dr. Sean Hellman, who is an expert in such matters as driver behaviour and new drivers in particular. But again, I will let him make his own introduction because he'll do a better job of it than I will. So throwing it over to you first, Chris, because you are one of our regular panellists and know what you're doing on this. Do you want to give people a brief intro to who you are and why you're here?
Sure. I'm Chris Benstead. I'm the co-founder of the DITC, Driving Instructor and Trainers Collective, signposting platform for the industry. And I started driving instructors on Facebook, so I know lots of them. So I get to talk lots about driving instructing and things like that. And I spend my day doing theory training nowadays.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. And Sean, would you like to give us your potted biography?
Yeah, hi, Carly. I'm a psychologist who works in road safety predominantly. I've worked in sort of transport and mainly road safety for about 20 plus years now. And yeah, as you said, driver behavior, driver training, testing, licensing, that's what the majority of my research has been about. So I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I'm just typing back to people in the thing who are all saying hi, so that's very nice of you. Okay, so I'm going to get straight into the meat of today's session, which basically is looking at the whole subject of graduated licenses, restricted licensing, called many things, understood in many different ways, or maybe not understood at all. And that's why we've got an expert in the actual specifics of this talking us to a night, not Chris Benstead, but Dr. Sean Hellman. And one of the first things I'm going to do, because I think there is massive confusion around this topic, is ask Sean about his definitions and what he knows and believes GDL to be about. But first of all, just to set the scene, many of you will have seen coverage in the media recently, early in May, that there could be the possibility that restricted licenses could come in for new drivers sooner rather than later, in the form of initially restricting young drivers so they can't carry passengers, or certainly passengers under the age of 25. That came about as a part of discussions with road safety campaigners that Richard Holden, the Transport Minister, had, and then hit the media, hence the explosion of experts such as Talia Storm, who is a wannabe singer and influencer, voicing their opinion, as well as the real experts as well. But the response by DFT to that, for them, unexpected media coverage was that there is no immediate plans to bring in a form of graduated licensing. However, amendments are being made to the Road Traffic Act, in particular the new drivers area, which would allow for the introduction of things like GDL in the future. It's not saying that GDL will be brought into being in any immediate future. It's making amendments to that act to make amendments easier in the future. At the moment, because the Road Traffic Act is primary legislation, it's quite onerous and hard to make such amendments that are sometimes needed in a very timely manner. And because the legislative process is so long, it would take so long to get it through that it would almost be ineffective when it's needed. However, what changes they are looking to make will allow for quicker amendments to that legislation. So again, just to reiterate, it's not saying that those amendments are specifically about bringing in GDL. It's about altering the framework so you could bring in new interventions much more quickly to help with road safety than we can do at the moment. So after all of that preamble and scene setting, over to you, Sean. What is GDL and restricted licensing?
Right, thanks, Carly. Yeah. Just a quick caveat to what you just said. That was news to me. We were discussing this before we came on, weren't we? And that was news to me that there's changes to the new Drivers Act being considered. But anyway, the terminology here is, I think, it's pretty simple, right? So yes, people use lots of different terms when they talk about graduated licensing, and they tend to use words like you just used, restrictive or controlling or whatever. But graduated licensing, as far as I can tell, typically refers to any licensing system with at least 3 stages. And that would be a learning stage, during which you have only supervised driving. Now, effective GDL systems tend to define the length of that system for reason of that period, for reasons that I'll explain in a minute. Then there's some kind of intermediate stage, and this is, I think, the thing that most people think of when they think of GDL. So there's usually in the intermediate stage, in effective systems, there'll be some controls on what types of driving you're allowed to do supervised and what types of driving you're allowed to do unsupervised. And typically the things that are restricted or controlled to only being able to do if you're still supervised by somebody is carrying, as you said, younger passengers, peer age passengers, and also driving in the dark. Lower blood alcohol limits as well is another one that tends to be seen in the more successful systems, but we're not quite sure if that's as successful as you might think. And then you get the full license stage where all the restrictions are lifted. Now, if you think about the current Great Britain system, if you stand far enough away from it, it looks a bit like a graduated system, doesn't it? Because you've got a learning stage and then people pass and then they are on probation for 2 years because of the new Drivers Act. And then after, if they get through that, then they're good to go and they have the full license. But the difference is there are none of the really effective components of graduated systems within the current Great Britain system, because basically the learning phase in practice we know is what, 9 months, a year, 6, it varies hugely. But in theory, it can be really, really quick. You pass your test and you are now able to drive in all circumstances. And other than those 6 points of the new Drivers Act, other than that thing, there's no other effective components in there. So yeah, that's what people mean when they say graduated licensing typically.
Okay, and what's the case in your, opinion, but also what's the research telling you for a form of GDL in terms of the graduated licensing element of it?
The case is pretty straightforward. We have really good, well, it's not the best quality evidence in the world. It's not like full randomized controlled trials or anything, but it's good quality evidence from many different jurisdictions around the world. We have systematic reviews telling us that it works. Simple as that. So, and the components that are most effective are minimum length of learning periods. Typically, it varies hugely by jurisdiction, but typically the longer your learning period, the safer your people are when they start driving unsupervised. And then controls on unsupervised driving at night and with passengers in the early part of the post-license phase. And, I don't know what to say other than it just works. It's by far the most evidence-based approach to young driver safety that we have.
Okay, so Sean's given us a really succinct explanation there, and some of you would have already had the handle on it already. Some were kind of confused by the terminology or what was the kind of ideal way of instituting something like GDL. Now that we've had that kind of expert view on it, and a little bit of evidence as well, you can use your emojis. It's in the reactions bar at the bottom of Zoom. And I know those of you who've been to these sessions before have used them. You should find that there's a thumbs up and a thumbs down, rather than me running a poll, which sometimes is quite tedious for a technophobe like me to get going. But can you guys that are on here just give us a thumbs up or thumbs down emoji to show us, what's your view? Do you think it would be a good idea to introduce some form of GDL in the UK, or a bad idea? And it seems like, the majority of people are saying it's a thumbs up. So that's good to hear. If you've got a contrary view to that, Motormouth is all about a good debate, people. So please speak up in the chat or ask a question, and we'll pick up on that as we go. Myself and Chris are going to be playing a little bit of devil's advocate tonight, because, it wouldn't be a debate if there wasn't, some kind of not opposition, but challenge to those kind of things. You talked about evidence, Sean. Has there been a proper evaluative trial as such that you would respect in your field of GDL where it's been implemented in other jurisdictions?
Yeah. And look, with evaluation of things like this, policy instruments or policy processes like this, you don't typically get full controlled trials, but what you do get is a weight of evidence building up over time. I think that the last systematic review, the Cochrane review from 2011, reasonably old now, but it was looking at about 3 decades worth of data, concluded that the evidence is incontrovertible. I think that's the word they used. So, and what's nice about the evidence base is when you look at it, I think in that systematic review, they find positive effects in every single study that they look at. Now, okay, there are some limits to what you can do with kind of before and after trials and, how you approach that. But that kind of weight of evidence and the fact that it makes theoretical sense as well, because what's interesting about GDL is it acts on the 2 main risk factors the 3 main risk factors that we know exist for this group. That is young age, lack of on-road experience in general, and also those specific situations of carrying passengers and driving in the dark. We know that those are situations that are really high risk for this group. So it's just saying, well, given that those are the high risk situations, let's give people a bit more time to get used to driving before they encounter those situations by themselves. So it's theoretically coherent, it works, it's quite simple.
Okay. And where in the world has GDL been brought in the kind of form that you'd like to see implemented in the UK?
Basically, New Zealand, I think, was the original adopter. And then there's several states in Australia, Canada, and pretty much every state in the United States as well. Let's go back to what I said earlier. It varies in all these different jurisdictions for reasons that are to do with the kind of discussion we're having now. People have concerns. I noticed somebody's put in the chat, it must be enforceable. I'd argue it doesn't need to be enforceable. People, generally enforce it themselves. Speed limits are not 100% enforceable, but that doesn't mean we don't have them, right? So there's a range of measures around this that sort of dictate what system you end up with, and that's fine. But let's just be honest what we're talking about. We're talking about the political or mobility or whatever it is. All these decisions come into the decision as to what you do with the licensing system. But let's just be clear, if the aim you want is to reduce collisions in this group, this is the best thing we've got. It doesn't eliminate them, because nothing's perfect, but it is the best thing we have.
I mean, previous discussions of GDL at a kind of ministerial level have always indicated that there's a fear that it wouldn't be an electorate pleaser. And perhaps sometimes the discussions about GDL have been too near to an election point, and it's not one of the things that they want to put on the table that they would be behind. It's almost like campaigners need to wait until there's a midpoint in a safe term for a political party who's got the guts to actually take it forward and aren't worried about the next general election. So yeah, certainly, as you say, in different jurisdictions, it'll be about political will and how much it's going to impact voters' feeling, and at what point you're having that discussion in that electoral cycle as well. Chris, I'm going to throw it over to you. You work with young drivers week in, week out, have done for many years. It's all very well people like Sean descending from, their academic cloud there to talk about this and tell you guys that this is exactly what we need. What's your view on graduated licensing?
All that evidence-based rubbish. So no, I think, we all know that there needs to be something done. That, the stats aren't what we want them to be. That, it was one of the first times I think I met Sean at a conference, and we were looking at the factors. What is there? What can we do? And what has always been apparent to me is we are in a minimum standards based industry, and I've always felt that's what holds us back, because we tend to end up working to that. So, the positives, I think anything that is going to make people safer. And I've spent all day trying to find some, chinks in the armor. That there don't seem to be any from a road safety perspective. From people's rights, which I think is really dangerous territory that often gets waved around, there's always going to be restrictions being put in place that are going to affect those. So we're going to have people who work nights, and if we've got a curfew-based system, it's going to affect them. There's going to be people that are affected from a cost perspective. So if you've got to get a certain number of hours, is it going to be hours with a driving instructor? Therefore, there is a cost attached to that. Or is it going to include some kind of tracking-based system where they can rack up hours, in private practice of some kind? So I think there's costs. I think there's all of those factors that need to be taken into account. My biggest concern is that we are reliant on a change being put out there and being understood, instructors being able to engage with it and be part of it and understand it. And the most recent change that we've got to reflect on is the change to the highway code, and the majority still don't seem to understand it. So that was a fairly simple change. This would be an enforced change, so there would be enforcement around it. So they've got to jump through those hoops. I think there'd be more fuss, if we had a whisper that turned into, to a number of phone calls that I got, I know you got, that were, people wanting to talk about it. But it was about opinion. It wasn't about fact. Can we get the facts out there, to be able to deal with it and support it? I'm not against it. My concern is always that we tend to work to a minimum standard, and the only one that I'm really familiar with is what happened in Ireland, which I haven't heard anybody say worked, which was officially X number of hours, which I believe were assessment hours, so they weren't actually teaching hours, but I think it was 10 hours of assessed learning, which was actually the equivalent number of pints down the pub to get it signed off.
Cynic that you are. It's interesting you say about rights, and just when you said that, I thought, oh, I really should have got the National Motorist Association on here as well if we wanted a good debate, because this would have been a dog whistle item for an organisation like them. And it's interesting how many times there is a story that is about driving that you would expect the media to go to driving expert organisations, but they actually go to things like the National Motorist Association, which usually is a bunch of people just wanting to have a rant about the fact that, cyclists have got too much, presence on the road at all, never mind too many rights. So I think, next time we do discuss this, I'm going to get somebody on from that organisation just for sheer entertainment value, if nothing else. But I was surprised that we didn't hear much from them when there was the recent media coverage. Maybe they missed it, because normally they're very good at getting something in the media about their response to it. I mean, and I know that in New Zealand, Australia, there was some pushback to the original plans around enforcement, and that was not necessarily criticism of the plans themselves. I think it was just a lack of confidence in the police forces in those areas. And we'd have the same cynicism here that, oh, you can't catch people for speeding, you can't catch people for driving without insurance and a license. In some instances, how the hell are the police force of the UK supposed to deal with, spotting whether someone's got a pass? Because there was at one point as well, wasn't there, a plan that there was a suggestion at one point that, you could only drive with somebody who was a relative in the car, which was odd because that cousin, brother, sister or father, they could be the worst distraction. I know my partner is to have when you're driving. I'd rather drive with a complete stranger, or one of my friends than any family member anytime. But I think that is people's, real concern is enforcement. It's interesting what you say about the, because I think that is a real concern, particularly with so many people going into the gig economy and, doing night shifts and those kind of jobs that, will it have an impact on employability and mobility? And Richard Holden, who is Transport Minister, for those of you who didn't know, whose actual focus is road safety. Richard Holden was supposed to be having a debate on this issue on the 16th of May. And I've checked back of Hansard and I can't see a reference to this debate happening in May. However, it's interesting that he himself, in a similar debate on the 11th of January, when asked by another MP about the idea of bringing in graduated licensing, he did himself express a concern particularly about mobility and employability, representing, as he argued, a rural constituency. So what do we think could be done about that particular issue? We're kind of agreeing that it's a good thing to look at and government really should seriously look at a form of GDL. But how do we get around some of those tricky bits, like, would we, for example, agree to exemptions for young people who are working late at night? And do we think that that's where there is a little lack of appetite from government because they're just thinking, oh God, then we're going to have to set up a system that's all about exemptions as well?
I mean, I can take that on if you like. I mean, the answer is yeah. And, look, the typical comebacks to this, I'm getting so bored of hearing them, I'll be honest, sorry to say that, but it's access to education and employment, it's access to services, what about carers, for example? It's rural communities, even though rural communities, we know, are the ones who are most affected by road risk for this group, because rural roads are the really dangerous ones. Its impact on social outcomes, its enforcement, and I mean, all of this goes away when you pay it any scrutiny, right? If you look at the evidence, I mean, what worlds do we live in where we think that every other country and every other state, 50, 60, 70 odd jurisdictions, I think, around the world have managed to do this? What is it about Britain that makes us so incapable of doing something that all of those jurisdictions managed to do? It's just mind-boggling. Now, I'm not saying it's, unreasonable to think about these particular barriers that might be in place and so on, but for goodness sake, if all of these other countries can do it, so can we. I would suggest we go and learn from them. And indeed, that's typically what we've done in the research, is we've gone and spoken to those people, and they tend to say things like, yes, it is a problem for people who need to access employment. Oh, what can we do about that? Well, let's have some kind of exemption for people, because it's not driving to your job at night that's the risky bit. It's driving with your mates socially at night that's the risk. That's the risky performance bit, right? So, yeah. Look, sorry, I'm getting a bit cross now. All of that's sensible, but it all goes away. It all goes away when you look at implementing a system, and of course, the system isn't perfect, but parents are the main. That's the other thing. Parents are the main enforcers. You don't have the police. The police aren't driving around trying to spot people who are driving without L plates, even though they don't have a full license. What does that mean? We get rid of the driving test. Yeah. Anyway, that's another debate. But
oh, would you be in favour of getting rid of the driving test?
Well, I mean, look. Okay, if you'll just indulge me, it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that we talk about not having restrictions on new drivers, and yet we have a driving test that people need to pass before we let them carry their. I can't, if I'm a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old who needs to drive to my job or drive my mum to hospital or whatever it is, I can't do that now unless I've got a driving licence. So what's the reasoning behind that? Well, I need to pass the test to show that I'm competent, safe. Okay, but that doesn't work, does it? Because we all know that young men pass the driving test at a rate that's higher than young women, but young men have more crashes. So what's the driving test doing? Now, look, to be clear, I'm in favour of the driving test, right? But the whole system is built on sand, and it needs to be looked at properly based on evidence.
So going down that track, because obviously we're just about to start running in the near future a trial of a form, I suppose, of graduated licensing, which is, looking at whether we should have and deliver a consistent curriculum of learning to drive, and that people, are mandated or asked at least to follow that curriculum. Is that another fix that you could see? It's not just about those post-test restrictions. It's actually having a better program of learning to drive on the way up. So like a set number of hours with a professional instructor would be a start that we don't have in the UK.
You again, I'm going to take that because I know Chris is writing an answer in the question and answer box. I mean, Carly, you and I have spoken a lot about this, and you know what I'm going to say, right? It's entirely sensible sounding idea to have a curriculum and all the rest of it. I would support that as a way of structuring everything we're talking about here. But the scientist in me cares not about what I think, but about what the evidence shows. So the main benefit, I would argue, to having a proper curriculum is not what people learn, it's the time it takes people to learn them. And that, having a minimum learning period, the older you are when you're licensed, the safer you are, right? Just simple maturation, your lifestyle choices, your brain development, all that stuff goes into the age effect. So I would argue that that's the key thing. Okay. I would say, by the way, that a curriculum is not a form of graduated licensing in the way you describe, but based on what I said at the beginning, really it's about the strength of the active ingredients. Yeah. But yeah, it's entirely sensible to have a structure to this because it professionalizes the idea of what driving is. It's people just take this for granted that they can drive around a couple of tons of metal at 70 miles an hour, and that all you need to do that is pass a simple test. Sorry, I know it's not really simple, but people are passing the test who are not safe, demonstrably. Yeah. So that's what this is about.
Yeah, it is a simple test. There's nothing that complicated on the driving test. There's not actually anything that complicated in driving. Doing it safely is sometimes a different thing. And the number of people that we deal with who, failed their test multiple times but happened to pass on a day where it was snowing, or, they did it because they went out on a day when there was no traffic on the road. And, there's all of those variables. It's not the most difficult test in the world. And actually, if we put other hurdles in place, I think they could be, they could be a real benefit. And I think maybe the rights and all of those things are actually countered by it becoming a more valuable asset. And I've seen a lot of positive things about parents being more involved, about a parental agreement. So it's something that I would like to see is that I think that's a cultural thing. It's not necessarily something that we would need to put in as part of a GDL system, but to encourage parental involvement. I've been looking at a number of things that they've been doing in America because of working with people with ADHD, particularly. They're quite interested in the differences for people with ADHD and the risk when driving. And there's a number of systems that they've got of different ways of teaching that are proving to be very, very positive and make big changes in fairly short periods of time. But one of the biggest things is that parental involvement, because they hold the keys.
I do agree, but I think
money and the car.
I think we'd have to then, if we look, and I completely agree. DVSA and I had a meeting the other day where they were asking my opinion on a next spur of, not giving anything away here particularly, but a next spur of their Ready to Pass campaign being focused more so on parents. And the one thing I was saying to them is it can't just be a communication campaign. It's got to be an educative campaign, because we know some of the mythology that's passed on about driving and some of the bad habits are coming from the same people that we want involved in the process. So would we have to look at some kind of program that I think the Swedish do, where if you are going to be involved in any way, coaching, for want of a better word, because they're not professional trainers, a learner, you have to go to some kind of seminar that's a mandatory thing before that process takes place to have that kind of download of the essentials of accompanying that person on that journey.
Can I sorry, Chris, you go on.
No, I was just going to say, I'd like to think that parents, if that was more available, that they'd actually like to, and it would also be a way of getting instructors into education. I don't think it necessarily needs to be legislative.
I'd like to play devil's advocate on that. So one of I hear this a lot. Parents teach their children bad habits where they're learning to drive. I'd love people to put in the chat what these bad habits are and why we should care, because as far as I can see, most of them are to do with stuff that will fail your driving test, which is a good thing for road safety because it keeps you off the road for longer. Right, that's just I'm over-egging that a bit, but whatever. The other thing is, Carly, if you get parents having to take part in some kind of training, that's a barrier to parents now providing their learners with more on-road practice. Now, the evidence for more and more and more on-road practice is not that, I mean, it's all right. It makes theoretical sense, but it looks like you need quite a lot of it for it to be really a big difference in safety. So, we're talking 120 hours maybe. Look, if I have parents now having to jump over a hurdle to be able to mentor their young person and give them driving lessons, I now am driving amount of on-road practice down, which is a bad thing. So I would suggest that the more important thing is to get parents and ADIs talking to each other. Maybe ADIs coaching the parents about the things they should be teaching. That'd be great. I wouldn't worry about the bad habits too much, unless they're insanely bad habits, like, speeding and not wearing seatbelts and stuff. But I get the impression most of it's about, stuff that might trip you up on your test, which I just don't think is as important.
I see a different world of that it's actually the other habits, because the ones that will trip them up on the test, they don't get through the test. The attitude, the beliefs about seatbelts and speeding and mobile phone use and response to road rage or actual road rage causing it, all of those factors, even just simple things like I can tell if a pupil's parents drive an automatic or a manual by the way that they get in the car.
All right, fantastic. And there's some really good things in the chat, actually. So I'm willing to stand partly corrected on that. No, absolutely.
You would never say you would be fully corrected.
We do not want bad habits of that type. But honestly, let's get the parents just getting the practice in. And if there are bad habits that the instructor needs to correct for the test, let's just live with that.
Yeah,
please, because it's all about more on-road experience.
The one thing I did say was obviously it couldn't be a course, it couldn't be a barrier. The only thing I'd say is in their campaign materials that they had some really engaging and interactive, very short form messaging about what could make you a better parent, and the organizations like us that are experienced in teaching full license holders through things like our advanced training, or on the ground driving instructors offer to take the parent out first as a passenger and talk to them and pass on tips about the best way to coach someone in private practice, because they're not training people because they're not professional trainers, but you do want them to do some coaching. And those who understand the benefits of coaching versus instruction, and you wouldn't want a parent to instruct necessarily unless it was a safety imperative, could pass on some great stuff. Plus you're getting a full license holder back in the car with a professional trainer. So I think, that would be a brilliant opportunity to offer people people. You wouldn't mandate it. You'd just say, this is something you could do, make it really attractive to people, you know, and that's up to the organisation marketing it to market it effectively as well. So those are some of the things that I was suggesting to DVSO be part of that campaign. And Pauline earlier in the chat said, you know, quite rightly, parents don't seem to know about the whole kind of national standards and the whole Safe Driving for Life curriculum, you know, and yet we can lay to a large extent the fault of that to organisations like DVSA and DFT who do some good communications campaign. I think Ready to Pass has been a particularly good campaign that they've run recently, and Think has got some great campaigns sometimes. However, the communication of the national standards as being a set of standards that, you know, are freely available and are a really good blueprint, you know, it hasn't been particularly wonderful. But playing devil's advocate, it's not just up to those government agencies to do that educative piece. Actually, it's at the coalface that piece could be done much more successfully. And there's some great examples when we've done this kind of session before, webinars, of ADIs who are taking their role to the degree really it should be as the, you know, community educator on road safety issues, and are making sure they spend time with the parent before the learning journey starts and agreeing roles. Not officially, but a kind of agreeing roles in this whole dynamic. And I actually think if you are running a business as well and you're working with third parties, that's always a great thing to do, is meet beforehand and agree roles on a project or a journey or whatever. So if you know, instructors aren't doing that, it's a why not. I know the challenge back from people sometimes, and Chris, you'll have seen these debates all the time in your forums, is parents don't want to know. That's a fairly typical response, isn't it, when this kind of debate has been held on your Facebook page?
Yeah, I've faced it with parents who basically said if I had that much time, I'd be teaching them myself. And, you know, I think the ADI badge isn't valued, you know, in that way. And I think, you know, if we can talk about the really good examples, because there's lots of them, people that do engage, people that do know what the national standards is and have actually read it. I still don't believe that's the majority of the industry. And I think one of the problems is, and say hopefully the DVSA have started to look into it, as we know from the most recent NAS minutes, is that some kind of structure inside of training instructors to be better at these things and have a better understanding. You know, if instructors had a very small percentage of the data that Sean's got at his fingertips, is, you know, that would help us, because it's out there, it's available, but it's not part of what we do because we jump through the hoops that we're given. So yeah, I think, you know, trying to get parental involvement, I absolutely love it. I've tried my best with my own pupils and the families that I've worked with, and some of them have been brilliant, but it's not the majority, because it's a right to drive. You know, once you've got the license, it never gets checked again, and all of those factors make it not very important. And the more that I talk about it, the more I think, you know, if we make it a bigger thing, maybe people will value it more and will appreciate it. And even if it is 50%, and even if it doesn't target those that we would like it to target, the real risk takers, it might still push them in that right direction a little bit. And, you know, to quote Michael Caine, if we can take a negative and be 0.25% closer to a positive, then we're winning in some way.
If I can just add to that, Carly, I would echo the sentiment that instructors, you know, in the system we have, instructors are such a critical part of it. And Chris and I were talking earlier about how, you know, I've in the past said, well, you know, there's no safety benefit of driver training. And yeah, I mean, broadly, when you look at the evidence base, that's true, but that does not mean we do not need professional, really motivated instructors delivering the kind of driving system that we're talking about here. It's a system-wide thing, and driving instructors have to be a really important part of that. And you know, even though I've gone from describing myself as pro GDL to, because I'm just bored of the debate now, right? I've gone to a point where I describe myself as,
I'm so glad we got you on to talk about
in support of GDL if the outcome you want to achieve is to lower collisions in this group. Right. So that's the standpoint I have. And if you want to achieve that, driving instructors have to be a part of that system and actually engaging with the industry to understand how they would support such a system if we decide to go down that route is essential. I'd absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, and I think it's a good call to arms for ADIs to get on board with, you know, any subsequent from this point on calls for GDL to be brought into being. And the other thing I'd say is, we talked about the standards, we talked about the safe driving curriculum, all that information that we say that parents don't take any notice of. I would shove it under their nose. That is a set of information and blueprints for what the instructor's supposed to teach and what the learner's supposed to derive from that process that is very easily accessible. And I think it markets the work that an instructor has to do and the goals they have to reach. And in turn, that markets why an instructor's in a better place to do that than the parents. You know, that very easy, well, I could teach my kids, but I just haven't got the time. Shove a set of the national standards for driver and rider trainers under their nose, plus the national set of standards for driver and riders, and say, okay, do you feel confident that you could take your kid through all of this and be able to perform at this level? Because that's what I've, been developed to do, and that's what I'm assessed against, and that's why I'm here. So I think, there are tools that we can use on the ground with parents to make them realize what the process is and to engage them in a better and more positive role within that process as well. I mean, from getting them to sit at the back on the first lesson or taking the parent out separately on an accompanied drive and talking to them about the role that they can and should take in the process, obviously without lecturing them and taking them to task, because I wouldn't put them in the driving seat, for example, and start critiquing their driving. I'd take them as a passenger and talk to them about the best way of coaching. The one question I haven't got to, and I was going to ask you again, Sean, there is an argument that if we were to restrict licenses for a period of, say, 6 months to turn the tap off on people's exposure to certain risks, what do we think we've got any further forward? Are we kicking a can down the road that when we turn back on that tap in 6 months' time, what do we think's happening in that 6 months, that intervening period, that makes them better able to handle those risks?
Well, I mean, it's going to vary by circumstance. So the thing to remember is that these things do reduce collisions. So even if it's an imperfect system, it's still doing good. And I would argue that the main thing that's going on there is maturation. So you're just older when you hit the risk, right? But your question hints at, again, thinking about how to make this as best as it can be. So what would be the ideal thing? Well, I would argue the ideal thing would be you have a period of time, and you keep saying 6 months. In some jurisdictions, it's longer than that. Yeah. In some, it's shorter. But, in that period when you are not allowed to, let's just remember, you're not allowed to drive by yourself in those situations. Well, what does that mean? Well, you should be driving supervised in those situations if you can. So don't see it as a single point in time when you start doing everything that you couldn't do before. See it as the clue is in the name. It's a graduated system, right? So driving with passengers, get some experience doing that while you're supervised and you're safer. Let's remember, when you're supervised, you're generally very safe. So I would argue that, again, is about improving the system as much as we can, but it shouldn't be a reason why you don't introduce something imperfect that works. In the same way that everybody on the road has a different level of competence. Yeah, some people should probably have a lower speed limit. We don't do that because it's too complicated, and the system we have works broadly. If we lower speed limits for everyone, it works. Okay, so yeah. So don't let perfect be the enemy of good, I think, is the way it's generally referred to.
Would you see it as being detrimental or positive if perhaps they initially brought in a form of restricted license post initial licensing, merely for those who had severe challenges with their driving, i.e. they were totting up points and it was getting to the point that they were having their license removed? Would you then say, let's bring it in initially for those people, and we won't take their license away completely, we'll restrict them in the areas that they're displaying risk for 6 months, we'll switch the tap off with those people, but not everybody? For
the avoidance of doubt, I would not support that, and the pure reason I would not support that is because I see no evidence for it. So you know, if you want to apply a system that works and that is based on evidence, you would apply what other countries have done in terms of lengthening the learning period and controlling access to driving with passengers and driving at night. What you're talking about is a potential future system that has tailored experience and training for everyone. Well, that'd be fantastic, but I don't notice people complaining about the costs of that when they are complaining about the costs of a relatively straightforward licensing process that might have some costs for some people, but we do know reduces collisions by 20-30% probably across the board. I mean, it varies, as I said, but you know. So yeah, I don't think there's evidence for what you've just suggested yet.
And it might make it a very negative thing in terms of people's perception that it's a punishment.
It might, yeah. Sorry, there's a really good question from John Howie in the Q&A, and I'd like to answer it if you don't mind. Sure. He says, what percentage of pupils would want a GDL system? There's a really interesting statistic on this. So the Transport Committee, when they looked at this last year or the year before, whenever it was, cited an Ipsos Mori survey from 2014, admittedly, but it was a representative sample of UK adults. And what they showed is that, what the Transport Committee said is that it demonstrates that young people don't like the idea of GDL. And I think they said something like 40% of people were in opposition. But interestingly, no, sorry, 40% of people were in support. Right, which if you just cite it like that, you think, oh, okay, well, 41% support, so 59% of people presumably were in opposition. No. 32% of people were in opposition, and the others were undecided or didn't know. So even the statistics that the government's Transport Committee cites, and this is one of the big pushbacks on graduated licensing. Oh, you know, young people won't want it. Well, yeah, okay. Steve Stradling, when he talked on this, used to say, well, yeah, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, right? But even when you talk to people in a proper survey setting, you don't get overwhelming opposition. You get people going, oh, it'll be a bit of a pain, but, you know, whatever, I'll deal with it. So, yeah, that's the answer to that question. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's to deal with a specific problem in a specific area. You know, I think we get too focused sometimes in these debates in the kind of microcosm, but also in the macrocosm in terms of policymakers, you know, legislators and things like that. They get very focused on the 20 rather than the 80. And they say, well, that wouldn't work because 20% of people would be very vociferous in their, their opposition to it. Where actually it's the 80% who are quieter and would be okay with it. And you know, they're the people we should be listening to by their very silence, rather than the people who are kicking off about it as well. So I think, you know, I think it would be there's a greater good at play here than upsetting a few people because they have to do something that is perceivably more onerous, but actually once they're in the flow of it, they might actually see the benefits once you know, in practice. It's just the thought of it, and it's the marketing of it, I suppose, as well. So
we're never good with change, are we? We'd always rather stay in a negative situation than actually take a step forwards towards positive change, because change is bad and we don't like it, and driving instructors are the worst at that, I think. But you know, we like the rules. We like knowing where we're at.
We're on here tonight, not a bunch of people on here tonight.
But we like what we know. You know, that's why we're in an industry that's based on a set of rules. And you know, so I think sometimes you need to look at it and go, actually, what are the benefits? What are we going to get from it? And it's so easy to look at those negatives. But just going back to the kicking the can down the road, I think that you develop experience, and therefore when it goes wrong, you're better enabled to deal with it when it's going wrong. So you don't need to have necessarily driven at night to be better at driving at night. Yeah. Or, you know, it's those kind of factors, because as you know, I have learned over the years, experience is key. The rest of it doesn't really matter. Hopefully us in the car help them make the best. We boost that experience, we tailor it and decide which way to make the most of it. But actually, you can't get away from the doing of it. You know, you can't get away from the fact that I can get the situation to go wrong quicker than someone who hasn't been driving very long but I can fix it quicker as well, hopefully.
Yeah. To add to that, Chris, I mean, you say driving at night. I think to paraphrase, you said you don't need to drive at night to be better at driving at night. I think there's a little bit of truth in that. There is some psychological learning theory to think about here, though. So we've got like a century or so of evidence that says the closer the training context is to when you're trying to apply that training later on, what we call the transfer context, the better that training will transfer. So, and this goes back to Carly's question. So I would argue the perfect system would be, you'd have your controls on nighttime driving and carrying passengers, and you would have a number of mandated hours of practice supervised in those situations to take you forward. But then that's making the system more complicated. And do we have the policy appetite for that? I don't know. Scientifically, that would be the best thing to do. But it doesn't mean that that's the only system we can introduce that will be effective.
But you don't have to be driving to get experience of driving at night. If once you've activated that bit of them that is now a driver, once you've given them those skills, they're going to be taking it on board, as any parent knows who's had a child in the car.
There are elements. Yeah, there are elements of the task that are general, but there are some that are specific as well. So I think that it would be useful to have practice at night as well. But yeah, anyway, we're getting into the detail now, and we probably don't need to.
That nicely segued into talking about, would there be any kind of training or testing in that period? Two of the questions in the chat that are in the Q&A that are very, very similar to that is, would there be any merit in revamping Pass Plus and making it compulsory, that it was completed in the first 6 months of passing the L test? And will there be a system such as Pass Plus that would allow upon completion of for GDL restrictions? And we just briefly discussed that in a kind of preamble to the session was, would you, in a perfect world scenario, would you take the 6 months, after 6 months, would you take the brakes off, the theoretical brakes, but have another safeguard of having another assessment, whether that was a theory test or an on-road or whatever? But as Sean says, that's adding complexity to the scenario. And I think a first introduction of GDL would be better to look at the actual restrictions and evaluate that, and then perhaps move on once people are in the mode of having to be in that world, having an assessment further down the line.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're talking about things which these are research gaps now. So if you look at what they're doing in the States now, they're starting to think about the components that they can add to or tweak in their graduated systems that will add value. And that's a really good example of one. Yeah, I don't know the answer, I'm afraid. Would it be good to use Pass Plus as the mechanism for that? I don't know. I don't really know. I've heard of Pass Plus. I've seen it. I don't know if it's a good brand to use, but it's a very sensible suggestion for.
I think if you did it, you'd have to rebrand it because it's lost so much traction and confidence.
You would say that, Carly, because you're in marketing, so you would know.
Actually, only a lazy, I would say, inexperienced marketer suggests rebranding. One of the laziest things you see as a consultant. Don't
look at me. I'm not in marketing at all. So
no, but I said only ever rebrand if you need to. The product's bad, or it's got reputational issues, or the company name is bad, or it's just not appealing to an audience. Otherwise, there's probably other fixes that you should be making other than a logo change and a color change or a font change. They're normally more strategic than that and about positioning, as in what people actually think of your brand and what it does. But I think Pass Plus is one of those problems that it's kind of lost its significance. And what is it? I think any form of advanced testing that, kind of looks at a person removed from the point of being a total novice and looks to see them having developed their skills, more akin to a diamond test and IM or ROSPA, but probably more specifically calibrated to the issues that young drivers had. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think I would personally see that as being something that insurers would use as an incentive to lower the premium rather than government mandating. Because again, we're trying not to make this thing onerous to people, and there would be more competition between insurers and a better deal for people that would become more engaging for them than government would ever be able to really significantly offer. We've learned that with other interventions we've looked at, that there needs to be some kind of significant incentives, and realistically speaking, only insurers can offer that. The government either has to mandate or it has to leave people that can actually sufficiently incentivize to have that traction. Well, gentlemen, we're kind of at the end of the session. Is there any kind of last pitches or points that you would make for GDL before we leave these good people to the rest of their evenings?
I have a question for Sean, which was when the whole COVID backlog and everything else kicked in. My suggestion was that we move the test to the age of 18, which would have negated the waiting list, and I believe would have benefited road safety. What do you think?
I think if you move the test to 18, what you're doing is delaying licensure, and that should, but based on most, or if not all, the evidence we've seen, the older you are when you pass your test, the safer you are. And I would anticipate that you would not see an extra year of time, because most people are passing, as quickly as they can. That I'm going to say. So if you raise the licensing age to 18, I'm guessing you might keep the practicing age at the same. So people would maybe pass a bit more quickly after their 18th birthday than they do now after their 17th. But yeah, you'd expect to see a benefit of that, I think. That's me without knowing whether that's even remotely a policy option, but you'd expect to see a safety benefit. I don't know if I have any closing remarks other than, again, to just reiterate the point that I think this debate gets very passionate, and what the thing I said earlier, I mean, it was a very flippant remark, and I'm sorry for saying it now. I'm not bored of the debate. I think I'm tired of the fact that the debate often comes down to I am passionate about a particular problem with the intervention we're talking about here, which is GDL, and therefore that's a reason for not doing it. And often the real debate is, well, we know it works.
Why would we do it?
The point you've raised is very important to implementing it, but it doesn't undermine the evidence base. And people often say, it just won't be enforced. Well, actually, does it matter? It works. So if it's not enforced in other countries, we know it works. So that's the thing I always come back to, and that's the thing I would close on, is to say, please just look at the evidence, and then all of those wonderful points and important insights that you have, let's put those into the implementation, not undermining the evidence base.
I think there are important points in a forming stage. I don't think they're barriers, because it's the same argument we make about driving licensing. Well, people are going to abuse it. They're going to cheat the system. They're going to copy them. Well, we still got them, and they still work to a greater degree. If we keep worrying about that 20%, we won't do anything, because we'll be pandering to either the fear or the vocal minority, and things won't evolve. And I don't think we should do that. So as a kind of last thing, if we can go to our reactions again, I'll take that mini poll again, using the thumbs up and down. Is everybody either in favour or opposed to GDL in the kind of scope that we've discussed it tonight?
I hope, given that everyone was in favour earlier, I hope nobody is now not in favour, because if that's the case, we have convinced.
They've got to come down emojis. They could be using that, but I don't see any on my screen. So Sean, you can, it's not necessarily evidence-based, particularly, but anecdotally, in your next discussions on this topic with other stakeholders, you can say, well, we spoke to Driving Instructors Association people, and they were all overwhelmingly in favour, in a good examination of the subject. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us tonight, and thanks for your inputs and your expert views on this topic, and thanks to all of you delegates who've joined us tonight as well. It really does make it interesting for us to hear your views, hear your questions as well. Keep your views coming to us on this particular subject. It's an ongoing debate in road safety stakeholders world. It can seem sometimes as if we're not necessarily aligned on it, because, as Sean knows, I'm somebody who likes to raise a challenge, but it is very much done in the vein of I'm in support of GDL, in such as we've spoken to it tonight. We're just still in the the norming stage, and we're looking at, okay, what are the arguments to go back to the people who are bringing up the negative challenges to it, because it's better to be able to have those arguments ready to kind of put them in their place about it so we can actually move on and get the job done eventually. And I completely understand what you said, Sean. You're not bored, you're frustrated because it's something that could make a huge difference. And we're not moving any further forward with it, despite, years of debate as well. So fingers crossed, we'll have a more positive movement on that if these amendments get made to the Act, which will make it an easier process to actually, develop these kind of frameworks as well. So again, thanks very much for joining us, everybody. This will go out in the next few days as a podcast if you just want to listen to it again, or you want to share it with friends, and also a video version will go on YouTube, but we'll send that all out in the membered update. So for those of you who've got school-age children like myself, I wish you a very good extra little bit that we've still got left of half term. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks again, folks. Bye-bye.